Hello, I'm Peter Switzer. Welcome to the program which puts you in touch with the best and brightest minds in the business. On the show tonight, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer Matthias Cormann will outline how Labor is getting it all wrong and what the Coalition's game plan will be. Simon Bond will explain why the market shot up today. Is the fiscal cliff over? Then we'll get the secret recipe of the Telstra Businesswoman of the Year, the founder of Carmann's Muesli and many other yummy products. And then we will focus on entrepreneurs doing it for money, but not for profit, with Robert Dunn of Opportunity International. Stay with us for the next hour. We'll bring you all the latest corporate news and market analysis, plus learn some valuable lessons from Australian success stories. If you have a question for me or our guests, email them to switzer@skynews.com.au, and you can follow me on Twitter, and the handle is @PeterSwitzer. Now, even more than the MRRT, the government's potential failure to deliver its promised budget surplus could turn out to be its greatest embarrassment. With crackdowns on super and business confidence less than sharp, measures the Gillard administration are taking are ho-hum to say the least. So would the Liberals do it better? To find out, I'm joined by Shadow Assistant Treasurer and Shadow Minister for Financial Services and Superannuation, Matthias Cormann. Thanks for joining us on the program, Matthias.
Good to be here.
Now, Matthias, I've always wanted to have you on this program for two reasons. One is you know what the Coalition's game plan is going to be in terms of economic policy, and also, and I thought I was going to be the first person to point this out, you sound so much like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah. Yes, but I do believe you are Belgian and not Austrian, is that right?
I was born in Belgium indeed, and this week, in fact, we had a very significant Belgium trade mission here in Australia, and still have in Australia a very significant trade mission headed by the Belgian Crown Prince, who started off in Perth and Port Hedland Monday, Tuesday, and is slowly making his way to Canberra.
Okay, well, that's interesting, I think, and I think probably one of the most important points I should talk to you about is business confidence. That seems to be one of the issues that really is avoiding the economy right now, and I don't think the government's doing much to help it. What would you guys do to bolster business confidence?
Well, I mean, I think the government, in fact, not only are they not helping, they're actually hindering it, because, I mean, the sort of shenanigans that have been going on out of Canberra, if anything, have made people in business less confident, not more. I mean, essentially, I mean, we've got to sort of start off with our basic analysis of where we currently are. And after 4 or 5 years of Labor, as a result of their economic strategy, it is our very strong belief that Australia is heading in the wrong direction. We had too much government spending, which has forced them to raise too many ad hoc new taxes. They're casting around for cash everywhere. We've still got $172 billion worth of accumulated deficits over the first 4 years. Then we had more than 21,000 new pieces of additional red tape. And of course, you've got that constant unpredictability where you never know what change is going to come next, which sort of has increased our sovereign risk profile. All of that taken together has led to increases in the cost of doing business, and of course, reductions in our international competitiveness and reductions in our productivity growth. So if you ask me what are we going to do better, well, fundamentally, our goal and our economic strategy is going to be focused on, firstly, being a government that lives within its means so that we can tax less. We'll be serious about cutting red tape. We'll be a government that goes through proper and considered policy development processes and that engages in a serious dialogue with business rather than to take them by surprise every second week about yet another fundamental shift. Because overall what we want to focus on is on bringing that cost of doing business in Australia down, making us more competitive internationally and increasing our productivity growth moving forward, because you know, if we're successful at all of that, that will lead to stronger economic growth, which of course will lead to increased economic prosperity, increased opportunity, and on the back of all of that also increased revenue for government, because increased economic growth of course leads to increased revenue for government without the need for all these new taxes.
But Matthias, do we assume then, if you guys should win the next election, the first budget would have to be a horror budget to get the books on the right track?
Well, at this stage, it's very hard to make sort of final judgments on, because we don't yet know what we're going to inherit as a budget situation. And just to explain that, the most recent final budget outcome that we've got in front of us is for the 2011 and 12 financial year, and that was a $43.7 billion deficit in that final budget outcome. And of course, in the lead up to the last election, in his economic update, Wayne Swan said that he expected or predicted a $10 billion deficit. That became a $12.3 billion deficit later that year, became a $22.6 billion deficit at the budget time, and of course ultimately deteriorated all the way to $43.7 billion worth of deficit. The point I'm making is, like, we've still got another 8 or 9 or 10 months, who knows how much more time to go before the next election. So there's still a lot of scope for the budget position to deteriorate further, and we will only be able to make final judgments on prioritization around spending, but also around necessary savings measures when we know what we're actually dealing with, when the pre-election economic and fiscal outlook is released by Treasury and Finance.
Yeah, I'll take that as a yes, Matthias, but let's move on. Let's go to what the ACTU has been belly aching about this week. And we can see where this is heading. It's heading towards the election, where they're saying that Australian workers have been overworking and employers have been underpaying, and the argument being that bosses should be paying people for work that they're actually doing, but because they're afraid of being sacked, or the new age of being competitive has forced people to work longer hours for the same amount of money. What is your response going to be to that? And it's clearly going to be the ACTU strategy when the election comes around.
Well, look, I mean, I doubt that we will be taking our economic advice from the ACTU, because I don't think that they'll have much, constructive to contribute to what we would be about in government. But I mean, fundamentally, obviously, productivity is going to be one of the key challenges, key economic challenges for Australia moving forward. And at the end of the day, I mean, you do have to have an open and competitive market within which people can find employment. And the first thing is to make sure that we've got businesses across Australia that are successful, so they can employ people and pay them a fair wage, of course. And I mean, in terms of our overall policy framework for the workplace relations area, of course, we will have some further announcements to make between now and the next election. But I doubt that the ACTU will have anything to say that is going to be relevant for us.
Okay, what about industries like the car industry, where the government has offered them support? What's your position going to be on these industries that clearly have taken protection but still seem to be contracting?
Well, I mean, the thing is, the current government has thrown a lot of money at the car industry, and yet still, we've seen job losses at Ford, where the Prime Minister earlier this year had been promising that 300 new jobs would be created. More than 300 people have sadly lost their job. I mean, what we've said in terms of support for the car industry is that it needs to be better targeted, and it needs to be properly benchmarked. There have to be some very, very specific targets that have got to be achieved for the support that is being put forward. Now, we've made some statements already that we would make some adjustments to the car industry support package. We think that what the government has been putting on the table has been too much, and it hasn't been targeted well enough, and there's certainly some scope for improvements. And quite frankly, what the government has been doing hasn't been effective either, because as you've said, there has been some further contraction anyway.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about the high dollar and the role of the Reserve Bank. Now, are you going to be courageous enough to say that the Reserve Bank has got it wrong and they should cut interest rates by more to get that dollar down to help the slow part of the economy?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, judgments on monetary policy are obviously a matter for the Reserve Bank, which is independent. But let me make a different point, though. I mean, part of the reason why the Australian dollar is so high is because still today, on a global comparison, Australian interest rates are higher than, for example, they are in the US or in Europe. And the reason for that is, and if you look at the sort of changes in interest rates over the last 4 or 5 years, what you'll notice is that after the global financial crisis hit, The official cash rate in Australia went down, but it bottomed out at 3% higher than in other parts of the world, and it started increasing. In fact, there were 7 successive increases. It went from 3% to 4.75%, when in the rest of the world, not only were they hovering around zero, but the US, for example, is printing money currently, $40 billion US a month. The reason for that difference is because in Australia, the government quite inappropriately spent too much by way of fiscal stimulus when our economic condition, when our general economic conditions didn't warrant that sort of intervention. So we ended up in a situation where the Reserve Bank was forced by the current government, effectively, to put the brakes on while the government was continuing to push down the accelerator. So the government was putting money out into the economy, and the Reserve Bank was forced to say we've got to actually slow things down a bit. Now that the fiscal stimulus has sort of worked its way through the system, the Reserve Bank has started to reduce interest rates again, but they're still higher than in other parts of the world. And of course in the US and in Europe, there's other stimulatory sort of activity taking place. So the short answer is the best way to actually put downward pressure on our currency is for the government to get its budget under control, to spend less, so that the Reserve Bank has got better scope to do what it thinks needs to be done on the monetary policy front.
Now, I know, Matthias, you are a politician, so being fair to the other side is very difficult to do. But part of the reason why interest rates are low in the USA also is that their economy, whether you want to accept that Labor's done even a reasonable job rather than the great job they're always crowing about, our economy, let's blame Howard and Costello, was in much better shape than the US. That's why their interest rates have gone. So, but in between, you would argue, I presume, that if the government didn't spend as much, maybe interest rates would have been taken down further, and therefore we wouldn't have the debt, but we still could have had the stimulation?
Well, I mean, that is exactly the argument. I mean, at the end of the day, back after the global financial crisis hit, like, you know, if the federal government, if the Labor government hadn't spent so much by way of fiscal stimulus, if the Reserve Bank felt that in their judgment there was a need for further stimulus, they could have reduced interest rates further, where, of course, by the actions of the government, they were forced to start increasing interest rates again. In fact, they increased them on 7 successive occasions. Now, the end result of all of that is that we're now looking at more than $145 billion worth of government net debt, coming from a position of no government net debt. And of course, when we could have had the same stimulatory effect much more efficiently without all of the distortions that came from pink bats and overpriced school halls and so on. Because whenever governments try to stimulate the economy by throwing taxpayers' money around, you of course get all of these distortions because it's not a very efficient way of stimulating the economy at all. So not only are we left with all the debt, we're also left with all of the wasteful spending and the consequences of all of that, when quite frankly, if the Reserve Bank had been allowed to do its job at the time, we could have avoided all of that.
Matthias, thanks for joining us on the program.
Good to be here. I'll be back.
I was going to ask you to say that, but I'm really glad you said it all by yourself. Thanks, mate. After the break, a strong day on the market after a rough trot as of late. I'll get the ins and outs with Simon Bonds of RBS Morgans.